So let's talk about what we're doing here. So we get the first service that accepted the URL. That's first of all what we do. Then what we do is, if we couldn't find one, we fail. Otherwise, we do get source dot do add source bind this followed by subscribe observer. That's going to look a little funky to you guys. So the do here will say, once the get source returns a value, invoke our add source method with that source that was retrieved from get source. This get source bind this is basically the same as do source goes into this add source. Maybe that's a little bit more clear. I don't often like writing it like that. I prefer using the bind method, but maybe that's a little bit more clear as to what's going on. Then we subscribe the observer. This is a cool little trick if you're doing stuff like this. So remember, the add source from URL is ultimately passed back into our observable socket, which will ultimately take whatever thing that this guy returns and pass it all the way back to the client, right? But we create this new observer that's not really attached to any sort of pipeline, and we kind of create our own pipeline. And then we defer the get source into the observer that was subscribed to by whoever invoked add source from URL. So who invokes add source from URL? Well, ultimately, it's going to be the client through our on actions. Ultimately, that's who invokes it. So our observable socket is going to subscribe to whatever was returned by this, right? So what's that going to be? Well, it's going to be this observable. But we want to kind of, in a roundabout way, sort of, I don't know, push through or alias out or chain another observable into that sequence. So we subscribe the observer, which is going to be observable socket, to the result of the get source, which is retrieved by our service. And that's what we're doing here. So when this get source completes, our observer completes. What happens when this observer completes? Well, our observable socket is going to tell the client, hey, this process is finished. So anyway, what's our add source? Well, our add source is very straightforward. It basically just does a synchronous operation for adding a source to our playlist. And what's that going to be? Well, first of all, we need to add the ID property to it. So ID equals this next source ID plus plus. So you recall the set playlist, how it does the same thing for each one of the sources that were added? Well, we do that here with our add source as well. Then I'm going to want to do something interesting. The add source method, the way that I'm going to be writing it, is it's going to always add a source immediately after what's currently playing, which we don't have that yet. We don't have the concept of a currently playing playlist item, which we're going to be doing next. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce the fields for the currently playing stuff, and then write the code normally. And then we'll actually go in a later video and implement the concept of currently playing. So what fields, what data do I need to keep track of to know what item is currently playing? Well, let's scroll up here to the top, and inside of our constructor, let's go ahead and initialize that. So I'm going to say this underscore current index equals -1. Then I'm going to say this underscore current source equals null. And this underscore current time equals 0. So these are the properties that are going to determine what item is currently playing. What index are we at in the playlist? What source do we have? And what's our current time within that source? So just know that these exist. Obviously, we'll be populating them in a future video when we implement the concept of a currently playing item. So let's scroll down to our add source. So how do we add a source after the currently playing item? Well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a couple properties. I'm going to say let insert index equals 0, and then I'm going to say after ID equals -1. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say if this dot current source, meaning are we currently playing something? If we are, set after ID to this playlist at this current item, or this current index dot ID. Alternatively, actually, we could say this current source. I don't know why I didn't think of this before. This current source ID. So we're saying the ID of the source that we're going to be adding is going to be, or the ID of the source that we want to add our item after is this ID. Then I'm going to say insert index equals this current index plus 1. So if we have a current source, we're going to insert it at this plus 1. Otherwise, we're going to insert it at 0. Then I'm going to say this playlist splice, and I'm going to actually insert it. So insert it at insert index with that followed by 0 followed by source. So I'm saying splice in this item at this index. Remember, the second parameter to splice is how many items to delete, which we don't want to delete anything. So that's why that's 0. And then, of course, say this IO emit playlist added, passing in an object with source and after ID. So we're going to tell all the clients that a source was added at that particular index after ID, which will either be -1 if it needs to be inserted at the top, or it's going to be an actual ID, and that will determine where it needs to be added. Then I'm going to say, if not this current source, this set current source, which set current source doesn't exist yet, but we're going to stub that out here in a moment. We'll implement set current source later once we actually add the concept of keeping track of what's currently playing. Then I'm going to say console log playlist added source title. So we get some feedback in the console that something was added. All right, just making sure that this code will work for our testing purposes, let's go ahead and stub out set current source. So take one last look at our add source method, and then our add source from URL method. And now I'll scroll up here, and after set playlist, I'm going to write a set current source. And actually, I'm just going to comment this out to make ESLint happy. We'll obviously in the future write out the implementation of this. But we actually have enough going on right now that we should be able to start implementing the client side before we even worry about adding in or fixing our YouTube service. I think that's the order I want to go in. So let's go ahead and make sure that this works. Let's open up our server, and then let's open up our client. And I'm going to refresh, and I'm going to go ahead and add a YouTube video. So add a video, and then I'm just going to pull in a random video here and try to paste that in. It doesn't seem like it wants to paste. You can do it. I know you can. All right, something's screwy with that. Hold on, I'm having a really, really terrible time with my clipboard. And, let's see. Let's try this for reals now. Okay, then hit OK. And check that out. Playlist added bleh object. Now, the object isn't what I was expecting. So let's jump back into this and check to see what we did here for this playlist added source title. But the title is added bleh dash object. Oh, added bleh dash URL. Okay, so our URL is not being set properly. So let's fix that. So we add source from URL, we validate it. We obviously have validated, because if it wasn't valid, we would have thrown. Oh, get source equals service.process service. Wow, how did I mess that up? We want service.process URL. Make sure that you fix that. Sorry about that, guys. So let's come back here into Chrome and our server. And we don't have to refresh because we reconnected. So let's go ahead and hit that and check that out. Added bleh dash and then the URL we passed in. So our adding code is now working. It should also be working from this perspective as well. But I think we'll worry about that in the next video when we'll actually add the logic for adding in item components. And then after we do that, then we'll implement our YouTube service.